Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome to our YouthPower Learning webinar. I'm Maria Brindelmeyer. I'm the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist with YouthPower Learning. It's a USAID-funded project that's primed by Making Sense. And I'm joined here also by Lindsay Wolf, our project manager from YouthPower, who will help to make sure that everything is running smoothly during the webinar. Before we get into the main topic, which is how to conduct research with adolescents in low and middle income countries, let me just say a few words about YouthPower Learning for our participants who are not yet familiar with YouthPower Learning and what we do. So we are focused on positive youth development. And what is positive youth development? It basically means that we are looking at youth as an opportunity, and in particular, we are looking at four major things about youth. One is focus on assets, giving youth the skills and the resources that they need. We focus on making sure that they have the ability to leverage those assets, agency, and I think John will talk quite a bit about agency today in his presentation. We're focusing on their ability to contribute to positive change for themselves, their communities, and also really important to make sure that they are surrounded by an enabling environment. So those four kind of key aspects are how we are defining positive youth development. And as YouthPower Learning, we do that by fostering and contributing to the learning about positive youth development through research, through grants. We have a website for sharing and learning, and we have communities of practice. And so on this youthpower.org website, which you see in the picture here, you can find what works in positive youth development, including a systematic review. You can find how to measure positive youth development and soft skills in particular also, and many other resources. You'll also find information about ongoing projects in countries like Mozambique, Central America, and the Caribbean, Jordan, Indonesia. So those are all youth power projects funded by USAID that are currently ongoing. You can join 4 communities of practice in youth and peace and security, gender and positive youth development, youth engagement and cross-sectoral skills. And you can review some very recent, really great grant deliverables focused on youth engagement, a lot of videos that have just recently been provided, and when available, there will also be future grant opportunities where you can apply, and you'll find lots of information about the event. So this brief introduction about YouthPower Learning, and now let me introduce our 2 main speakers for today, which is Nicola Bellman and John Santelli. Nicola is from UNICEF's Office of Research in Ogenti, and Dr. John Santinelli is a professor of population and family health and pediatrics at Columbia University. And each of them is going to introduce themselves a little bit more when they're speaking. And so our topic today is how to conduct research with adolescents in low and middle income countries. And UNICEF and John have created a great set of resources that they are going to talk to us about today. And before they start speaking, also a reminder, there are different polls. So while you're listening, please complete the polls. And then there's a chat box at the right, in the bottom corner on the right. Please enter your questions as we move along. Or if you have any problems with audio or something, please type it in there so that we can respond to your question at the end. So with that, let me hand it over to Nicola.
So thank you very much, Maria, for that introduction, and also on behalf of John and UNICEF, thank you to YouthPower and partners for hosting us to do this webinar. It's we have done something like this previously for colleagues in UNICEF, and because these briefs were done as a public good, we were really looking for a platform to reach a wider audience. So it's really great that we are really grateful that YouthPower took it upon themselves to host this webinar. So as Maria said, my name is Nicola Bellman. I'm sending greetings to you from the UNICEF Office of Research in Innocenti, which is in Florence, Italy. And on the line is my colleague and co-editor, Professor John Santelli from Columbia University. The plan is to kind of talk you through this project of 7 briefs on how to conduct research with adolescents, really using this conversation as a means of discussing why the focus on adolescents in today's world is so important and the role of research in it. So we will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes and then use the remainder of the webinar for a question and answer session. So we're really using a discussion about these briefs that John and I co-edited as a platform to discuss adolescent well-being and research more broadly. And thank you for completing the poll. We can see that about 81% of you conduct research on or with adolescents, 16% commission it, about 50% of you participate in policy advocacy and program design. So that's really important. So it looks like we have an audience of researchers in the room. So we will talk about research methods, but we'll also talk about how these are applicable to policy and programming more broadly. So just to set the context, obviously the world today is home to 1.2 billion adolescents. It is the largest cohort in history, and 90% of them live in low and middle income countries. However, despite this increased focus and the prominence that adolescents are receiving, whether it's in the SDGs, through the global strategy on women's, children's and adolescent health, we have limited data collection systems which tell us about their situation. We have limited longitudinal research, and in terms of what works, evidence there is also lacking. So in this context, we wanted to contribute to some of these gaps in knowledge by putting together a series of briefs on what are some of the best practices on conducting research with and about adolescents, and what is unique about this group, keeping in mind that this is such a period of rapid growth and development and really an opportunity to intervene and address some of the things that may not have gone well in early childhood. So the poll we have already done, so I'll move on. Also, to contextualize this further, the briefs that we are talking about are part of a much larger research program, which is multidisciplinary or multi-sectoral. It is a program that we are running here at UNICEF's Office of Research in Innocenti called the Research Program on Social and Structural Determinants of Adolescent Health. You can see on the slide in front of you those research projects in pink. Those are the topics that we are looking at. So it's anything from child marriage to parenting support, violence, cash transfers to support adolescent transitions. So those are the primary research projects that we are running, but we also have this focus on data, methods and measurement, and as part of that, that includes indicator development, research syntheses, gap maps, and as part of that, research methods. So the briefs we are presenting are a smaller component of a larger program which is funded by DFID. Now, the program itself, as well as the briefs, draw a lot on the work done by the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Wellbeing, of which John Santelli is one of the pioneers. And this figure in front of you is kind of extremely important in that it takes the individual adolescent and sees them in the larger context, so the determinants of health and well-being, whether it's the school, the family, the community, the policies, so sees them in this socio-ecological context, as well as seeing adolescence as a phase of life which is influenced by preconception health of the mothers to the health in early childhood development, and then influences what happens later in life in adulthood and across the life course of the individual, but also of the next generation. So this really holistic approach of where adolescent well-being comes from and how it influences other stages in life and also the next generation. So, Lindsay, I'm not seeing my slides. I'm not sure why they are blank, but I'll keep talking. Hopefully they will appear again. So we developed 7 briefs on how to conduct research with adolescents. Okay, so now the slides are appearing again. And the objectives of these briefs were to improve the understanding of how to conduct research with adolescents and measure adolescent health and well-being, to provide an overview of the different methodological approaches, and to identify what is unique about doing research with this group. So there are some things that are unique that emerged during this time, and John will particularly talk about that when talking about ethics and decision-making. When as opposed to children, adolescents do have the cognitive capacity to make more sound decisions about their involvement and participation. They also, because of the maturing brain, are able to participate in research more and safely. So there are some things that are unique when conducting research with this group as opposed to younger children and adults, and we try to identify that. On the slide, you also see a link to the briefs. So if you like, type that into your browser and look through them with us as we walk you through it. The topics of the briefs, coming up with them was a consultative process of consultations between researchers and practitioners from different disciplinary backgrounds, where the researchers were identifying some of the challenges they face when conducting research with adolescents, and the practitioners were discussing the knowledge gaps that they encounter when involved in program design and policy advocacy. And as a result, we came up with these 7 topics, so an overview, then also discussing data and indicators on how to measure adolescent health, social development and well-being, so what is available in large-scale surveys like the DHS and MICS, and so on. So what kind of indicators and survey systems do we have at the national and global levels? Ethics, which is brief 3, which John will talk about. Then how to conduct research with disadvantaged, vulnerable or marginalized adolescents, which is extremely important as we talk about equity and reach and leaving nobody behind. Both programming and research often don't go that extra step to reach vulnerable adolescents and children. So really looking at how they can be counted. Adolescent participation in research, so that is a big topic, how to use these new capacities to involve adolescents in research. And there already was a webinar hosted by YouthPower with Emily Ozer and Amber Piet on this topic. Russell Weiner, in his brief, talks about the social and structural determinants of health and well-being. So how do we measure some of those other determinants that influence the individual? And then finally, in brief 7 looks at the multidimensional effects of economic strengthening interventions. So this looks at, for example, how to measure the impacts of cash transfers and other social protection. So altogether 15 authors and 6 institutions, so quite a big effort. Today, because of time constraints, we will look more deeply at two briefs. So, Rebecca, you asked for the link again. It is on the screen in front of you. So once again, if you'd like to click on that and look at the briefs as we walk you through it. So today we'll look more deeply at two briefs. Brief one, which is an overview, so that is to kind of set the stage, and I'll do that quickly. And then John, who is the lead author and really an expert on this, will talk about inclusion with protection and how to conduct ethical research with adolescents, focusing on some of the things that are different. So just quickly, let me walk you through the first brief, which was authored by Nicola Bellman and Susan Sawyer from the University of Melbourne, and just highlight some of the key issues that are highlighted here. And a lot of this brief is based on the report from the Lancet Commission called Our Future, a Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Wellbeing. So they really drew quite heavily on this. But setting the scene, it is important to recognize that adolescence is a critical phase where we move from childhood to adulthood. It is a phase of biological, cognitive, emotional, sexual development. And what happens during this phase has consequences across the life course. It is a period where these social transitions happen, where a child is developing into an adult, but that phase itself, in terms of global demographics, is undergoing a change, where we are, because of greater survival and lower fertility, we now have the largest cohort of adolescents in history. It is also a period which is longer. So due to improved health and nutrition in low and middle income countries, the onset of puberty is earlier, and also due to various changes, social and other, it's often lasting longer. So traditionally, adolescence was something that started with puberty and ended with marriage or parenthood. But because of various changes, when you look at it from a social perspective, it is more perhaps transitions to employment and other adult responsibilities that mark the end of adolescence. It is not as clear anymore when it ends from a social perspective. But in UNICEF and also the WHO definition in terms of years of what adolescence is the 10 to 19 period, and that's also what we used in the briefs. So hence adolescents are up to the age of 18 covered by the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is distinguished from youth, which are 15 to 24, and then the term young people, or sometimes adolescents and young adults, which is 10 to 24 years. So the briefs really highlight that adolescence is a period of opportunity and vulnerability. It is a time when the maturing brain brings new opportunities, for example, for adolescents to be more involved in decision making about their lives, for decision makers to consult them and include them. But it is also a period where a lot of the risk behaviors that then have an effect across the life course set in. So whether it's smoking, alcohol, substance abuse, and so on, onset of those behaviors begins, as well as neurologically vulnerabilities to do, again, with brain development, such as the onset of mental illness. And some of the negative outcomes across the life course, whether it's intimate partner violence, some of these risky behaviors often have the onset in adolescence. So that is why it's such an important period for intervening. And because of the rapid changes and the growth and development of the brain, it's a period where some of the things that may not have gone well in early childhood, in the ages of 1 to 5, could be addressed via interventions and so on. But while there is a recognition that this is the time to intervene, the evidence on how we do this is limited. So we have evidence on small scale interventions, but how do we scale them up and how do they work at scale is not so well known. Data collection systems at the national and global level are limited, as are longitudinal studies to really understand what determines what. Evidence on early adolescence, the kind of the 10 to 14, is very limited. And but evidence from low and middle income countries is limited. So with the exception of sexual and reproductive health, most evidence is from high income countries, particularly the USA. And then it is really important to also disaggregate, because of the extended years of adolescence. The early adolescence as opposed to the later adolescent period are quite different. So, and then of course in some research there is disaggregation by mid-adolescence. So it is important to keep that in mind and consider whether the evidence from one segment of this population applies to the other and in what circumstances. Now, neuroscience has really given us quite a lot of new understandings through technologies such as magnetic resonance imaging. We know that this is the second biggest period of brain development after early infancy. And particular growth happens in the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive and self-regulatory skills. So hence why adolescents are able to make decisions similarly to adults. It's also a period where they are very sensitive to emotions and status and their social orientation. A sense of belonging is increased and the influence of peers is very important. And then the social and structural determinants of well-being are very important to keep in mind for programming and research. So what is it, at the policy, school, families level that is influencing outcomes? So in terms of interventions, I think the agreement is that holistic, intersectoral and multi-component action is required. Where possible, interventions that are structural should be, such as policies, should be coupled with those that are at the community and at the school level. Media and social marketing and online interventions are particularly fruitful for working with adolescents, because they are, across the world, they are often the ones that use technology the most. But when delivering, for example, interventions or conducting research at the school and health center level, it is important to couple that with something else, particularly when we are thinking about the vulnerable adolescents or marginalized who may be out of school. So, school surveys are great for the majority of adolescents, but those who are not at school do not get captured in them. So it's important to have something, to have other research, other interventions, programs that reach this population. And of course, desegregation by gender and other marginalized groups and minorities is extremely important in order to reach them. So that's kind of a nice segue to what John will talk about next, which is how to include adolescents while also ensuring their protection in research and programs. So I'll hand over to you, John, now to do your part.
So, well, thank you for that segue, Nicola. It's delightful to be with you all today to talk about a set of issues that I feel strongly about.
Hello, John.
UNICEF
Can you hear me?
Very supportive in advancing about how to do research with young people. Thank you to YouthPower for sponsoring this session. I can hear you, Nicola. Can you hear me? Folks, can you hear me? Let me know if you can't hear me. I'm
we hear you
watching
both.
into my
Thank you.
slides. Okay, so someone says they can hear me. Good. So one of the briefs. Okay. Good. So one of the briefs focused on this issue of inclusion with protection, and it is a wide-ranging look at the ethics of research with young people, and importantly, it pulls in concepts from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we talk about things like the value of research with young people, with adolescents, the importance of balancing inclusion and protection, and sometimes research ethics committees only focus on protection, but importantly, I think today most of them are now understanding the importance of inclusion. There's clearly been evolution in social thinking about adolescents' human rights and legal protections, so we try to reflect that. We cover things like ethical principles and research ethics guidelines that are available to you. We try to encapsulate current scientific understandings about adolescent decisional capacity and the capacity to provide informed consent. And the neuroscience that Nicola just mentioned is essential in understanding that decisional capacities. We also talk about what to do when parents or guardians are not acting in the best interest of the adolescent. And finally, we end with some ethical and practical recommendations for conducting research with adolescents. Okay, next slide. Can we get the next slide up? There we go. So here are just some key concepts. Inclusion is the right of individuals or groups to participate in research and to receive benefits. And literally it's the notion that if young people are not included in research or any other group is not included in research, they're unlikely to receive full benefit. Protection is that, the safeguards we do to prevent harm in research, and we put people at risk in certain cases with certain kinds of research, and so we need to be always cognizant of how we protect people. So the usual ethical principles that are invoked in thinking about research ethics are respect for persons, the right of an autonomous individual to make free decisions, and but also this notion of protection of vulnerable persons. And clearly, children are vulnerable persons, younger children are vulnerable persons, and they deserve, so part of respect for them is those special protections we often provide them. The notion of justice or equity, a fair distribution both of the benefits and the burdens of research. Beneficence, the obligation to do good and to do harm. So information follows from these principles, the notion of informed consent, so people need to get information, they need to be able to, capable or able to understand information that we provide them. And finally, research participation needs to be voluntary. We don't force people into research. So we have some special concepts with young people. With children, we talk about assent, which is a child's affirmative agreement to participate in the research. And that notion of assent recognizes that there is some decisional capacity as early as 5 and 6, but that it may not be completely formed, and therefore we talk about assent. We also talk about parental permission, which is the agreement of a parent to their child's participation in research. Generally, the parent is the person in the world who's most interested in the welfare of the child, and therefore is often the best person to help make a research decision. But as we all know from our own experience, parents are not perfect, and parents do at times some pretty terrible things. So we may waive parental permission where it doesn't make good sense. The notion of minimal risk, and this is sort of a mouthful of a definition, but it's if you think about minimal risk, you should think about activities of daily living or what might occur in a routine visit with a healthcare provider or a social provider. So it's that risk of talking to people, perhaps drawing blood, um, that we think about. And certain research with children is determined by the levels of risk. Okay, next slide. Can we get that? Yeah, here we go. So related to these ethical principles are some legal concepts, and many of these are common to people who either provide health care or involved in program development. As you will see, these legal concepts are coordinated closely with the ethical ones. So there's an age of majority, the age at which adolescents become adults and attain all the legal rights and privileges of adulthood. This is commonly age 18. A child, both in U.S. federal regulations, but also Convention on the Rights of the Child is defined as under the age of 18. Emancipation is the achievement of adult legal status before the age of majority. So people may become emancipated by marriage, motherhood, military service. There's also the notion of a functional emancipation. A 15-year-old who's living on their own, coping with the world on their own. There are so-called minor consent laws that often allow access to health care independently before the age of majority. Treatment for STIs, HIV testing, pregnancy prevention, mental health services are some of those minor consent laws. Next, there's the notion of a mature minor, and that literally sort of means what it says. It's derived from common law, and it's literally the capacity to make independent judgments when faced with specific life decisions. So laws around, for instance, abortion that require parental permission, parental notification, often have a specific exemption, and that's based on the notion that a young person may be able to make that decision themselves. Finally, in terms of concepts, is the two that we tried to pull in, particularly from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, are the notion of evolving capacities. And this is a totally sensible concept that I think we all understand, that the ability to make autonomous decisions develop with age and maturity. I have some adolescents at home, and they definitely display evolving capacities, the ability to make their own judgment in certain areas. In certain cases, I provide some guidance, and my wife does as well. But that's the notion of evolving capacities. And generally, adolescents from about age 12 or 14 begin to show the cognitive capacity to, or show, what should we say, fully matured cognitive capacity to make autonomous decisions. Finally, the best interest related to the notion of beneficence, but recognizing the person over the child, the need to provide protection and to promote the human rights and other rights like participation in their own decision making. Next slide. So there's lots of barriers to conducting research with adolescents. Some of it's misunderstandings about adolescent decision-making abilities, and what should we say? There's often a misuse of that adolescent neuroscience that Nicola mentioned. There's oftentimes an overzealous valuing of protection over inclusion. Both are important, and one should not be privileged over the other. Sometimes it's issues of institutional self-protection. IRBs may be more interested in, or ethics committees may be more interested in protecting the institution than in promoting adolescent health. And finally, there's just some antiquated attitudes about adolescence. So next slide. Okay, so these are just a couple of quotes from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Let me cover them quickly. The committee recognizes children's evolving capacities have a bearing on their independent decision-making, on their health issues. That includes research. In accordance with these evolving capacities, children should have access to confidential counseling and advice without parental or legal guardian consent, where this is assessed by professionals working with the child to be in the child's best interest. Again, riffing, if you will, off the legal principles I mentioned a minute ago. Finally, states should review and consider allowing children to consent to certain medical treatments and interventions without the permission of a parent, caregiver, or guardian. Next slide. Okay, so this issue of decisional capacity is critical in deciding particularly who should provide informed consent. So adolescents do display cognitive abilities for agency, for judgment and self-protection. And these are fundamental to the capacity to provide informed consent to make decisions themselves about research participations. And remarkably, early adolescents are generally able to make sensible decisions about research and healthcare. Importantly, in the absence of coercion and unhealthy influences such as peer pressure. This is research going back literally 100 years to Piaget and others. In general, 14-year-olds, more recent research suggests that 14-year-olds are as capable as adults in understanding multiple viewpoints and considering conflicting information. And importantly, adolescents may want to seek the support of parents and adults in making decisions, even where we don't necessarily require parental permission. The brain science is evolving very rapidly, particularly neuroimaging, but also functional imaging that tells us what parts of the brain light up when adolescents make certain kinds of decisions. Clearly, decision making is influenced by age. Just mentioned that, social context. Adolescents make different decisions when they're in the office with us and when they're out on the streets with their peers. It's influenced by experience in making particular kinds of decisions, by emotional states, and also the risk and complexity of a particular study. And importantly, we make the recommendations that research ethics committees should include a professional who works with adolescents and understands adolescent development. A research ethics committee looking at cancer chemotherapy would not feel comfortable moving ahead unless it had someone who had expertise in cancer. And so ethics committees that around the globe really need to have someone who has adolescent either developmental or clinical kinds of experience to help them make these kind of decisions. Okay, next slide. So again, capacity is very linked to previous life experiences. So if a child has an experience with a chronic illness, or if they've been involved in their own self-care, they make much better decisions. If they're a cancer patient, for instance, they make much better decisions about cancer chemotherapy because they know all about that. Capacity is also related to adverse social events and environments and risk behavior. So adolescents that have experienced social deprivation or environments like that probably make stronger decisions. And those who are familiar particularly with the use of the healthcare system on their own are also likely to make better decisions. Now many people suggest adolescents make crazy decisions. And they do sometimes make decisions that make adults cringe a little bit. It's important to distinguish, though, when they're making good decisions and when they're not making such great decisions. And again, I think Nicola mentioned this. So there's this notion of hot cognitions that in affectively, emotionally charged social interactions with peers involving things like drinking or other risk-taking, adolescents may make some pretty poor decisions. On the other hand, when you get an adolescent in a cold cognitive state, this decision making, this is the kind of clinical setting, a research setting, a classroom. Adolescents make decisions very similar to adults in those kind of more controlled, non-emotional settings. Next slide. So, when are parents and guardians not able to act in the best interest of the child? Again, I think I've mentioned before, they're often the essential protectors of children in the world. My screen just went, okay, there it is. However, parents often fail to fulfill this duty. So we know that we have laws about child abuse and child labor and child marriage, and all these are designed essentially to protect young people where the parents have failed. Similarly, laws allowing adolescents to seek health care independently when parents recognize the potential for conflicts of interest between the parents and the adolescents. And parents may coerce adolescents to make decisions contrary to their best interests. So we know the story of child marriage. That's one example. But parents may pressure young people to abort a pregnancy or to continue a pregnancy when that's not what they want to do. To work instead of attending schools, to use contraception, or to forbid contraception. And finally, in the case we're talking about, to participate in research or to forbid participation. Next slide. I see I'm getting some active commentary. I hope I will try to get back to this, but I think these are all great comments. Okay, so parental permission is problematic and should be waived when a conflict exists between the best interest of the adolescent and the parent. An adolescent is, the second reason would be an adolescent is capable of making independent decisions about their medical and mental health care or social services, and or is legally empowered to make those decisions, as in the minor consent laws. The adolescent is legally emancipated because of age or status, or other functionally emancipated, where the parents are functionally incapacitated, unavailable, or otherwise unable to provide permission. So we know parents are often affected by drug use, by mental illness, by other kinds of poverty that make them unable to function well. Where the adolescent is estranged from parents, where the adolescent is capable of providing informed consent from research based on the principle of evolving capacity. Okay. Next slide. So, in various kinds of guidance, both from places like the Society for Adolescent Health and Medicine, but also governmental guidance, say from the government of Kenya, informed consent can be obtained directly from adolescents, particularly for things like minimal risk studies, studies that present the possibility of benefit, and studies that involve procedures commensurate with the adolescent's experience. We suggested in our research brief for studies involving considerable risk and the potential for direct benefit, the capacity of the adolescent to consent may be assessed by a social or health professional, someone who is serving in that in a helping role to help make sure that adolescent is making the best decision. And when informed consent is obtained directly from adolescents should be encouraged to seek the advice of parents and other family members and trusted adults. Just because we don't require parental permission, that doesn't mean we should not encourage adolescents to seek out the advice of other family members, which may be helpful. And finally, the government should consider removing the rigid age restrictions and unnecessary parental consent requirements that impede adolescents' access to research. So next slide. We have some cases coming up. Okay, so this is our first case study. I think this should be pretty familiar to you. I think many of you know that adolescents, particularly adolescent girls, are at high risk of HIV infection, new infections throughout sub-Saharan Africa, both in particularly Southern Africa, but also East Africa. In this case study, investigators in Kenya are planning an in-school randomized clinical trial of a gender-based sexuality education program. They're also going to be providing supports to stay in school. We know that many young girls drop out prematurely because of school fees or because of the lack of school uniforms. So that's going to be provided. In this scenario, students 13 to 18 would be followed for 3 years, and there'd be periodic knowledge, attitude, and behavioral questionnaires and HIV testing. So, given that quick scenario, what are some of the ethical issues? And feel free to type these into the chat section. What are the risks and benefits? What are the best interests of the adolescents involved? Who can provide informed consent? What can we say about evolving capacity in this case, and what can we say about legal status? Are there any special considerations that we should think about? So I'm going to give you a second to type in some of your thoughts about this in the chat feature. And if I don't, I can walk you through some key points of this. Well, let me launch into some of the considerations in this first case. So in terms of ethical considerations, what do we know about what is already working in HIV? We have some evidence, for instance, that education, HIV prevention education, is often effective in changing behaviors, not always, and sometimes the effect sizes are pretty small. Educational trials in general are considered minimal risk. Schools provide education all the time, and we don't worry about that very much. We can also think about whether the trial itself would put young people at risk. Does filling out questionnaires or does HIV testing, is that more than minimal risk? Most people would suggest that neither one of those is more than minimal risk. We need to talk to young people, we need to educate them, and HIV counseling and testing is often available through national governments outside the research setting. So, as I mentioned before, in terms of informed consent, adolescents from about age 12 or 14 are able to make, in cold cognitive states, can generally understand risks and benefits, so probably they can make their own decision here. And we do want to respect the evolving capacity of the adolescent. However, it's important to note that parents of adolescents in school are often highly motivated and highly involved in the lives of their adolescents. And how do we respect the role of parents in these kind of cases? And importantly, the parents can be an important support system for young people, both to stay in school, but even to stay in what's going to be in a 3-year longitudinal study. In terms of, again, Nicola mentioned some of the other briefs look at things like adolescent participation and youth involvement in their own kinds of research. How do the researchers involve young people as co-leaders in this kind of a research project? And in terms of special considerations, Kenya is one of the few countries that has very specific guidelines on conducting research on HIV and sexual and reproductive health, and the reference to that is found in the research brief. And those guidelines address, again, evolving capacity, the ability to provide fully informed consent, emancipated and mature minor status, dissent and assent, and circumstances under which it's important to waive medical permission.
Hi, John. John,
And so,
yes.
I'm looking at the chat feature.
John,
so
just briefly, I think we should think about wrapping it up. So I want to give some time for us to answer some of the questions that we have had. So it might be better perhaps to skip the next case study so that we have some time for discussion. Would that be okay with you?
That's totally fine. That's great. So I'm One issue is the issue of verbal or written consent, as I can see in the chat feature, or written consent. I think research ethics committees have broad latitude to make decisions about that, whether it needs to be written or generally I would think written assent in that case study would probably make sense. But it's also true that schools oftentimes have opt-out, opt-in features that allow a parent to remove an adolescent where they feel uncomfortable, but generally don't require written parental permission. Okay. So I think my last slide is up. So I think this is these are broadly our recommendations. We need to shift our thinking about adolescents from subjects of research to agents in research. We need to move from inclusion versus protection to thinking about inclusion with protection. We need to harmonize laws and regulation of influencing research participation. We need to respect adolescents and as persons and as right holders. And clearly we need to build on our previous science, including the neuroscience, in making this kind of decision. So
John, thank you. And I'll mention some of them. So one of the questions, John, was how are these ethical concepts different from what applies to adult involvement in research? And I think you mentioned some of the specific aspects in terms of their consent, but perhaps if you want to just mention a few highlights.
Sure. I think the ethical concepts are universal and applied to children, adolescents, adults, people of all ages. I think what's unique is this notion of evolving capacity, which makes sense for children and adolescents. But so I think that's true. I think, and there's fairly widespread the ethical guidance, which I haven't gone into, but it's listed in the research brief. There's a variety of international bodies and some national bodies that have their own guidelines or regulations. And I think those are essentially harmonious in the sense that they apply the same ethical principles, the same legal principles to research with adolescents.
John, one of the questions I had also in my mind is, are there any countries in particular where you would suggest that it is more important to get parental permission than perhaps others, and based on your experience?
I mean, I think based on my experience, the parental impulse to protect our young people is widespread. That's why we all survived childhood, it's so how that's applied in particular settings is quite different. I think the Europeans are much more comfortable with waiving parental permission, for instance, in healthcare kinds of settings. But again, I think it's less the country than the community, and I think it's really important that researchers pay close attention to community feelings and parents' feelings about research. And generally, when research is explained to parents and to communities, they're pretty supportive.
Yep, I think Fabiana also mentioned something in the chat that I think is really important, and perhaps you can elaborate a little bit on that, which is that it's really important to include a commitment to give the information back to the young participants, to let them know what was done with the information that they provided. You want to perhaps add to that?
No, I think that's a great point. It's an important consideration. I think that's true of all kinds of research. I think there's maybe we should always provide information back to communities, governments, and citizens and research participants. I think it's very important for adolescents as well. They feel like they've made a commitment to help us and to do our research, so providing information back to them is sort of the epitome of respect for persons. I think in some cases there may be some challenges to that, particularly where parental permission has been waived. Think about how we carefully and thoughtfully provide information back to them. But the principle is strong. It's a question of perhaps how one should best do that.
So one question is, Kristen says that she's interested in participatory methodologies, and the question is regarding child and youth participation in the Innocenti research. How have their voices and views been included for setting the research priorities? Like, has there been a child panel that's been involved in the decision making? And if not, as to why not? And that might be, I think it's probably a question for both of you, John and Nicola.
Well, I can answer quickly. There is a whole research brief by Emily Ozer on involving young people in research as active, not just as advisors, but as active participants in setting research questions and defining research methods. But I think UNICEF's been a leader on that. But I turn it over to.
Sure, and Kristen, it's a good question, and to be honest with you, for our particular program, in terms of the large 4-year program, there wasn't a lot of consultation with young people. The priorities there were identified in a much more traditional way in terms of looking at the literature and looking where the gaps are, and because so much of that research is global and kind of cross-cutting across countries. However, at the country level, UNICEF does do a lot more participation, particularly when it's looking at more applied and operational research, where young people would be involved in identifying issues and even doing some of the participatory research themselves. We are trying to get better at this. So, for example, right now we are working on a synthesis report of our 4-year program where the main findings are synthesized, and we are producing an adolescent-friendly version of that, and also kind of their take on those findings will be used to guide future programs. But yeah, to be honest with you, this is something that we do need to do better, and UNICEF has developed a whole new strategy on youth participation for the next 4 years for our strategic plan.
I see we have several additional questions that were just posted. And let me start with the one that talks about youth and adolescents that are particularly at risk and vulnerable. And what I want to say about that, perhaps we'll just talk about it briefly today, but it is, I think there's a separate brief, and we are planning on bringing the UNICEF team back for a future webinar that particularly can focus on that topic. But if Nicola or John, if you want to tackle that question briefly, and we'll just run over a little bit, like 2 or 3 more minutes, since we started a little bit late.
John, do you want to take the question on doing research with particularly vulnerable adolescents? Yes, please.
Do you want me to try to answer that one? I think. Sure. So the it's often easier for research ethics committees to approve research with, say, street kids or vulnerable adolescents. So I think we really have the paradox of those young people often been significantly traumatized by adults, whether it's communities or parents, but many of them, for instance, if they're street kids, are on the streets because adults have failed them in many cases. So we often think of them as emancipated or functionally emancipated, but it's also, it's very important in approaching those young people that we do not re-victimize them. We do not extend the traumas that they've experienced. So working with people who know vulnerable adolescents in those settings.
And a question from Alex.
Who are the medical or social work people who have been working with them becomes really important. And being sensitive.
Yes, you're back.
Can you hear me?
Let me jump to the next question, which is, and the last question also. We heard most of what you said, but you dropped out at some point. In the interest of time, let me jump to the last question, and we will provide answers to the questions that we haven't answered right now in writing afterwards. So if you still want to add some additional questions now that we won't be able to answer on the phone now or on the webinar now, please feel free to do so, and we'll try to get the answers from Nicola and John afterwards. But a kind of very specific question here is, John, we're working on an intervention for pregnant adolescents and new mothers aged 10 to 19 in Kenya. Would they be considered emancipated and therefore able to give consent without parental permission? The household-based intervention, so parents will also be involved, but unclear on how much they can or should restrict girls' enrollment in the intervention. So John, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. So, sure. So adolescents are often fractured by age considerations, but certainly the 18, 19-year-olds are considered adults. Under 17, you'd actually have to look at the specifics of Kenya law. In the U.S., you have to look at the specifics of state laws, and there may be something analogous in Kenya. But you also can look to those Kenya, national guidelines on research on sexual and reproductive health. So I'm not answering your question specifically because I don't work in Kenya. I work in Uganda. I can answer it there, but. So I think one has to always be cognizant of the local legal rules, and they will shape your. They're not going to change perhaps your common sense about what the best way is to proceed, but they're going to shape the way you justify that, explain that to the research ethics.
All right.
In Kenya.
Well, unfortunately, this is the last question that we can address on the webinar, but as I said, we'll get back to you with answers to any of the other questions in writing, and we'll capture all the resources that were posted here during the conversation so that you all will have access to that. So let me thank John and Nicola for a really great presentation and great discussion. Thank you. I'm sure we will come back to you for different questions, and I really encourage you all to read those briefs. They are extremely detailed. They have wonderful resources, and I certainly encourage you. I hope that you will find them useful as you're doing your own research in different countries. And thank you for joining us. We will send out the information for the recording and everything to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marianne, Lindsay, for having us, and thank you to everybody who joined us.
Yeah, we really appreciate everybody. Yeah, Lindsay and Maria, thank you, and thanks to all the participants.
Thank you, Nicola and John. We'll leave the room open for a little bit. But thank you everybody for joining, and have a wonderful rest.